The Whispering Woods did not just hold silence. They held secrets. Bouncy navigated the labyrinth of gnarled roots and swaying branches, his paws barely making a sound against the damp soil. Every step felt measured, as if the forest floor were testing his intent. He stopped abruptly, his whiskers twitching. The wind shifted, carrying a scent of ozone and something much older, like dried parchment. He looked left, then right. The canopy overhead seemed to knit itself tighter, blocking out the light until the path ahead was nothing but a corridor of shadows. He did not run, but he moved with a frantic precision, darting between the thick trunks that groaned under the weight of the encroaching evening. Something was buried here, something that pulled at the air itself. He pressed his back against the rough bark of a towering pine, listening. The forest breathed in unison, a rhythmic hum that vibrated through his feet. He pushed off the trunk, his eyes fixed on a cluster of vines weaving around a massive, decaying stump. The air grew colder, and the faint, rhythmic pulse of a hidden presence began to beat in time with his own heart. He was close. Bouncy circled the base of the ancient tree 3 times. It stood apart from the others, its trunk scarred by centuries of storms and deep, jagged fissures. The hollow he sought was hidden behind a thick mesh of thorny vines that clawed at his fur. He did not retreat. He bit down on a thick, woody stem and pulled, his muscles straining against the resistance of the stubborn plant. The vines snapped with a wet, sharp crack, clearing a narrow path to the opening. He stepped forward, his breath hitching in his chest. The hollow was a void, darker than the surrounding woods, and it seemed to pull the light away from his eyes. He hesitated for a fleeting second, his paw hovering inches from the dark threshold. He could hear a faint, rhythmic vibration emanating from within, a sound that resonated deep in his bones. He took a steadying breath, gripped the edge of the hollow with his claws to anchor himself, and thrust his hand into the cool, absolute dark. His fingers brushed against something solid, something smooth and cold that did not belong to the wood. He braced his feet, hooked his claws into the interior wall, and began to pull the object toward the sliver of daylight. The object slid free with a sound like grinding stone. Bouncy pulled it into the dim light of the woods. It was a book, bound in leather that felt warm and oddly alive under his touch. He dropped to his haunches, his heart hammering against his ribs. The surface was etched with patterns that seemed to shift as he stared. He placed a paw on the cover, and the book shuddered. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the binding, vibrating through his arms and into his chest. Then, the seams began to crack open with a soft, persistent glow. A sliver of golden radiance leaked from between the pages, piercing the gloom of the forest. The light grew, steady and intense, washing over his paws and bleaching the bark of the trees until they looked like pillars of polished amber. He tried to pull away, but the book seemed to anchor him to the spot, the hum rising to a melodic, steady drone. The woods around him fell into an unnatural, absolute silence. Every leaf, every shadow, every blade of grass caught the golden hue. Destiny had arrived in the form of a simple, glowing volume, and the world began to blur at the edges of his vision. The book did not wait for him to open it. The heavy leather cover lifted on its own, snapping back against the spine with a sharp, resonant crack. Pages began to turn, flickering in a rapid, rhythmic sequence that created a miniature gale. Golden light poured out in jagged sheets, catching the dust motes in the air and spinning them into tiny, swirling galaxies. Bouncy stumbled back, his paws sliding on the soft forest floor, but the book held his gaze. The humming noise deepened, shifting from a dull drone to a high-pitched, harmonic chime that rattled his teeth. He felt a sudden, sharp tug in his gut, a sensation like falling upward. His initial hesitation vanished, replaced by a surge of heat that spread from his chest to his fingertips. He reached out, his claws twitching, drawn to the chaotic energy spilling from the parchment. The pages were no longer just paper. They were windows displaying flashes of vast plains and distant horizons. He leaned into the light, his ears perked, his breath coming in short, eager gasps. The fear that had anchored him to the roots evaporated, leaving only a sharp, electric anticipation for whatever lay on the other side of the glow. The solid trunks of the whispering woods began to ripple like reflections in a disturbed pond. Bouncy reached out to steady himself against an ancient oak, but his claws met only cool, shifting vapor. The world was losing its grip on existence. Colors bled together, the deep greens of the moss and the brown of the bark swirling into a chaotic, luminous vortex. He felt a sudden drop in pressure, a vacuum opening beneath his feet that pulled the very ground away. The familiar scent of damp earth and pine needles was replaced by the smell of ozone and starlight. Every tree, every leaf, every patch of shadow stretched and elongated, transforming into thin, translucent ribbons of light. He tried to call out, but the sound was swallowed by the high-pitched ringing that now filled his ears. His surroundings were no longer a forest. They were a kaleidoscope of dissolving matter. He was suspended in a void where up and down had lost all meaning. The edges of his vision blurred into a singular, blinding point. He squinted against the onslaught of brilliance, his body feeling weightless as reality finally shattered into a million fragments of golden dust, leaving him drifting through the silence between worlds. The sensation of falling stopped abruptly. Bouncy hit hard-packed earth with a jolt that rattled his bones. Dust puffed up around his paws, dry and grit-heavy. He blinked, shaking his head to clear the lingering starlight from his vision. The cool, damp air of the woods was gone, replaced instantly by a wall of dry, searing heat that pressed against his fur. He stood up, but the horizon seemed to tilt. Before him lay a vast expanse of sun-scorched steppes, stretching out in every direction until the earth met the sky in a shimmering, hazy line. There were no trees here, no shade, only the relentless golden glare of a sun that felt twice as large as the one he had left behind. He took a hesitant step, the ground beneath his feet hot enough to radiate through his pads. The silence here was different. It was not the quiet of waiting, but the heavy, expansive stillness of a place that had seen centuries pass without interruption. He squinted against the glare, his shadow stretching long and thin across the cracked, thirsty soil. He gripped his book tighter, the leather warm against his chest, and looked out over the endless, empty, golden landscape. Bouncy pressed forward, his paws navigating the uneven, baked earth. The wind carried a faint, dry scent that did not belong to the empty plain. He crested a low ridge, and the landscape shifted. Below him, nestled in a small depression, shielded from the biting breeze, a thin column of blue smoke rose into the shimmering air. He descended the slope, the heat easing as he approached the source. There sat a man. He occupied a circle of calm in the middle of the vast, aggressive heat. An old man with a long, white beard rested on a woven mat, his fingers curled around the neck of a saz. He did not look up, yet his presence seemed to command the very stillness of the air around the small, crackling fire. The crackle of the flames was the only sound in the world. Bouncy stopped several paces away, the book still clutched in his grip. The sage moved with deliberate, slow grace, adjusting a log in the fire. He radiated a profound, ancient patience that made the surrounding steps feel small. Bouncy waited, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the embers, feeling the intensity of the sun replaced by the quiet, steady warmth of the sage's hearth. Dede Korkut lifted his gaze. His eyes held the depth of ancient wells, clear and unblinking. He did not speak, but he extended a hand toward the shimmering horizon. As his fingers traced a slow arc through the air, the heat haze caught the movement. The atmosphere began to distort, warping like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The dry, golden light grew intense, pulsing in time with the faint vibration of the saz resting at his side. Bouncy watched, mesmerized, as the distant plain seemed to fold and unfold. The air ripples moved outward in visible, translucent waves, rolling across the baked earth with a low, melodic hum that vibrated in the soles of his feet. This was not merely the sun playing tricks on the vision, it was the fabric of the land itself yielding to the sage's intent. Dede Korkut's expression remained serene, yet his hand remained outstretched, anchoring the ripple. The shimmering space between them deepened, turning into a window that looked out onto a different time. The silence of the steppes vanished, replaced by the weight of a story demanding to be told. The horizon held its breath, and the air waited for the first movement of the saga to emerge from the haze. The shimmering haze snapped into focus, thinning until the golden light revealed a solitary figure. Boğaç stood in the center of the vast, sun-scorched expanse. The ground beneath him was a tapestry of fine, gray dust that clung to his boots with every slight adjustment of his weight. He looked small against the relentless breadth of the landscape, a mere point of life in an ocean of baked earth. He turned his head slowly, scanning the horizon where the heat shimmered in rhythmic pulses. His shoulders remained square, set against the dry wind that whipped through the scrub brush. He held his hands at his sides, fingers curled into loose fists, his posture steady and unyielding. There was no movement in his face, only a keen, watchful focus that cut through the haze. He shifted his stance, planting his heels deeper into the shifting soil, creating a solid base that defied the instability of the plains. He appeared entirely alone, yet his presence possessed a gravity that anchored the scene. The dust swirled around his ankles, dancing in the updrafts, but he did not blink or turn away. He waited, his breathing rhythmic and deep, watching the empty distance with the calm certainty of someone expecting a trial. The quiet of the steppe intensified around him, a heavy, expectant stillness. The stillness that had gripped the steppe began to fray at the edges. It started as a low, guttural vibration, a sound felt in the chest more than heard by the ears. Boğaç stiffened, his head snapping toward the northern rise, where the heat haze burned thickest. The rhythmic drone of the plains vanished, the wind died, and even the insects ceased their chirping. Everything turned brittle and thin. From the distant brush, a deep, wet snort echoed across the expanse, rolling over the dry grass like thunder. Boğaç narrowed his eyes, his hands tightening into hard, white-knuckled fists. Then the light changed. A massive, jagged shadow stretched out from the horizon, crawling rapidly over the parched earth. It elongated, swallowing the scattered rocks and the patches of dry scrub, moving with a predatory speed that defied the stillness of the air. The shadow reached the edge of the clearing, cool and dark, pressing against the heat of the sun. Boğaç did not retreat. He braced his legs, his boots grinding into the dirt as he faced the source of the encroaching darkness. Something enormous was tearing through the landscape, its heavy breath audible now. A ragged, rhythmic rasp that promised violence. The ground trembled under the weight of an approaching giant. The shadow broke. From the tangled brush at the edge of the clearing, the beast tore into the light. It was a mountain of muscle and matted hair, a bull of impossible size. Its head swung low, nearly scraping the dry earth, and its horns, thick, jagged, and stained, pointed directly at Boğaç. A spray of foam flew from its nostrils as it let out a roar that shook the very air. Its eyes were wide, swirling with a frantic, animal fury that ignored everything but the target before it. Boğaç stood his ground, though the sheer scale of the creature made the earth seem to tilt. The bull dug its hooves into the ground, a rhythmic, violent scraping that sent rocks skittering across the dry expanse. Every muscle in the animal's shoulders bunched and pulsed with raw, unchecked power. It was not merely an animal, it was a force of nature driven to a boiling point. The bull lowered its head further, neck cords straining, and fixed its gaze on the young man. It stopped for a heartbeat. its massive chest heaving, steam rising from its hide in the midday heat. Then, with a sudden, bone-jarring impact, it lunged forward, the ground cracking under the force of its first explosive step. The earth surrendered. As the bull accelerated, its hoofs tore through the baked surface of the step, launching jagged clods of dirt into the air like shrapnel. A thick, suffocating veil of dust rose instantly, rolling outward in a dense, swirling curtain. It choked the sunlight, turning the sky a bruised, hazy brown. Inside this screen of debris, the world narrowed to a singular, violent sound, the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of hooves hitting the ground. Each strike sent a fresh tremor up through the soles of Boğaç Han's boots. He stood motionless, his vision clouded by the grit that stung his eyes and coated his skin. The bull was a dark blur within the storm, its presence signaled only by the relentless roar of its charge. Dirt whistled past his ears, peppering his arms and face. He could feel the pressure of the displaced air pushing against him, a hot, dry gale that smelled of churned soil and wild, unchecked adrenaline. The horizon vanished entirely, replaced by the churning wall of dust that fed the bull's momentum. Boğaç stood in the eye of this man-made hurricane, watching the shapes dance in the haze, waiting for the mass of muscle and horn to pierce through the gloom. Boğaç felt the ground vibrate, a deep, rhythmic hum that traveled from the soles of his feet into his marrow. He did not retreat. He shifted his weight, digging his heels into the hard, sun-baked earth, until the dirt gave way and locked his feet into place. He lowered his center of gravity, bending his knees, his hands open and ready. The smell of the bull, musk, hot dust, and raw animal heat became overwhelming. It was a suffocating wall of scent. Through the swirling haze of debris, the massive head of the beast loomed, a dark, unstoppable shape, hurtling closer with every heartbeat. Boğaç took a slow, deliberate breath, his lungs burning with the grit of the steppe. He watched the horns, those jagged, wickedly pointed spears, cutting through the dust screen. They were inches away now. He tightened his stomach muscles and braced his neck, his entire frame tensing into a singular, rigid point of resistance. The roar of the beast was no longer a distant sound. It was a physical pressure, a blast of hot air against his skin. Time seemed to stretch, the space between the man and the beast vanishing into a heartbeat of pure, static potential. He planted his palms, set his shoulders, and waited for the world to collide. The impact hit like a landslide. Boğaç felt the breath leave his lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp as the bull's weight slammed into him. The force was absolute, a sudden, blinding collision of bone and muscle. His heels bit into the dry soil, carving deep, jagged furrows as the beast's momentum shoved him backward. He skidded, the dust rising in a fresh wave around their feet, but he did not let go. His fingers hooked deep into the rough, coarse surface of the horns, his knuckles turning white from the strain. The bull snorted, a wet, guttural sound that sprayed grit onto Boğaç, chase, and tossed its head to shake him free. Boğaç dug his toes into the earth, his leg muscles bulging, his spine curving as he poured every ounce of his strength into the resistance. He stopped the slide. The bull's heavy, rhythmic breathing rattled against his chest. He held firm, his arms shaking under the crushing weight, locking the beast in a stalemate of pure, unyielding force. He stared into the animal's dark, furious eyes, feeling the heat radiating from its massive shoulders. The ground beneath them cracked, a spider web of fissures branching outward from their locked feet, as the struggle shifted into a brutal test of endurance. The pressure was absolute. Boğaç felt his muscles burn with the heat of 1,000 fires, his shoulders screaming under the weight of the beast. Every fiber of his being was directed into his grip. His arms were locked, rigid as iron beams, holding the massive head of the bull in place. Sweat carved clean paths through the dust on his skin. The bull lowered its neck, digging its front hooves into the earth, trying to drive the man into the dirt, but Boğaç did not yield a single inch. The ground beneath their feet groaned. A fissure appeared, snake-like and jagged, spreading out from the point where Boğaç braced his heels. The soil crumbled, turning to fine powder under the sheer intensity of the downward force. He could hear the crackle of dry earth giving way, a sound like snapping twigs in the silence of the steppe. The bull let out a low, vibrating hum that traveled through the horns and into Boğaç's palms, a challenge of pure animal vitality. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tight, his entire frame acting as a pillar of stone against the moving wall of muscle. The air shimmered with the heat of the effort. They were trapped in a frozen moment of absolute, crushing tension. Two forces locked in a silent, violent debate of strength. A guttural roar tore from Boğaç's throat, a sound that cut through the heavy heat of the steppe. He took a single, deliberate breath, expanding his chest against the bull's massive forehead. He shifted his stance, moving his rear foot an inch deeper into the parched earth, and drove upward with his legs. The effect was immediate. The bull's front hooves, previously anchored deep into the soil, shuddered and slid backward. A new sound rose above the wind, the rhythmic scraping of horn-clad feet against stone and dust. Boğaç felt the change in the beast's balance, a momentary tremor of doubt in the creature's frame. He did not let up. He poured his weight into the push, his spine aligned like a steel rod. The bull began to retreat, its massive frame stumbling as it was forced to give ground. Every step backward was a victory, marked by deep, jagged trenches carved into the sun-baked ground. The beast's neck muscles pulsed, veins standing out against its hide, as it fought to regain its footing. But Boğaç was a moving wall of force. He drove forward, step by heavy step, turning the tide of the struggle. The air vibrated with the sound of his exertion and the bull's frantic, desperate snorts. The power had shifted, and the tide of the battle was now in his hands. Boğaç pressed into the bull, his eyes locked on the creature's straining neck. The animal's front legs trembled, the joints shaking under the unnatural reverse force. A sharp snap of bone-deep resistance echoed as the bull's left knee buckled, its hoof skidding uselessly into the gravel. The creature's center of gravity vanished in an instant. Boğaç didn't pause. He surged forward with one final, violent shove, his boots tearing through the top layer of scorched earth. The bull's other leg collapsed, folding inward like a broken tool. It hit the ground with a force that sent a shockwave of dust billowing outward in a wide, choking circle. The impact was deafening, a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the soles of Boğaç's feet and rattled the dry air of the steppe. The bull's massive head slammed into the dirt. Its momentum halted completely. Silence surged back into the gap, left by the roar of the struggle. Where there had been the frantic scraping of hooves, there was now only the settling of loose earth. The dust cloud hovered, thick and golden in the harsh light, obscuring the horizon. Boğaç stood above the fallen beast, his chest heaving, listening to the sudden, heavy stillness of the plain. Boğaç remained standing, his feet planted firmly in the churned earth. He drew in long, ragged breaths, the air burning his throat as the adrenaline ebbed. Beside him, the bull lay motionless, its massive frame no longer a threat, merely a weight on the ground. The dust cloud, once a thick veil of grit, began to thin, pulled away by a rising breeze. He wiped the dirt from his face with the back of his hand, his skin slick with sweat. Across the steppe, the horizon sharpened again. Not a single creature moved. The wind had died, and the tall grass stood frozen, as if the entire plain were holding its breath. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the raw expenditure of force. He flexed his fingers, feeling the ache in his shoulders and the thrum of his heartbeat slowing against his ribs. The silence was absolute, heavy with the gravity of what had just passed. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping the empty expanse, waiting for the world to resume its rhythm. The heat continued to shimmer off the ground, but the violence had drained out of the air, leaving behind a stark, quiet clarity. The golden light of the step did not fade, it was devoured. The heat that shimmered off the scorched earth vanished, replaced by a sudden, biting draft that tasted of wet minerals and rot. The vast horizon, once open and limitless, folded inward. The sky above lost its clarity, turning to a jagged ceiling of uneven stone. The ground beneath shifted from loose, shifting dirt to cold, unyielding rock that leached the warmth from the soles of his feet. A wall rose up, slick with moisture, blocking the sun. The sound of the wind, which had carried the scent of dry grass, died in an instant, replaced by the rhythmic, hollow drip of water hitting a stone floor. The transition was absolute. The space grew cramped, the air thick and stagnant, pressing against the lungs with the weight of unseen tons of granite. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and impenetrable, swallowing the light until only the gray, oppressive texture of the masonry remained. The wide, sun-drenched expanse was gone. In its place stood a single, narrow cell, silent and heavy with the smell of damp earth and trapped time. Bamsı Beyrek remained seated on the floor, his frame angled toward the single, high sliver of gray light that filtered through the grate. His skin was pale, marked by the lack of sun, and his movements were slow, deliberate, and heavy with the inertia of years spent in this confined space. He did not pace. He had learned long ago that pacing only sharpened the edge of his restlessness. Instead, he sat motionless, his back pressed against the weeping mortar of the rear wall. Feeling the cold seep through his frame, he shifted his weight, and the sound of his joints popping echoed sharply against the low ceiling, a reminder of the silence that governed his existence. His gaze remained fixed on a single crack in the opposite wall, tracing the same path he had mapped every day for what felt like a lifetime. There was no sound of life from beyond the heavy door, only the distant, muffled thud of footsteps that never stopped at his entrance. He was entirely alone. The air in the cell felt thinner here, stagnant and stripped of oxygen. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and steady, attempting to anchor himself against the encroaching weight of the shadows that filled every corner of the room. Time had become a physical presence, pressing down on his shoulders like a leaden weight, yet he did not flinch. He simply endured the stillness. Bamsı shifted his weight, his fingers brushing the rough seam where the wall met the floor. He found the sharp, jagged shard of flint he had hidden there months ago. With a slow, measured breath, he turned to the masonry behind him. He pressed the flint into the stone, his knuckles white with the pressure of his grip. He began to scrape. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic rasp that tore through the heavy air of the cell. Gritty dust flaked away from the surface, falling into his lap like sand in an hourglass. He moved the flint down in a steady, vertical line. His arm trembled from the exertion, the muscles tight and strained. The flint slipped, skidding across the wall and leaving a shallow, jagged scar. He paused, his breath hitching, and waited for the sound of a guard to investigate the noise. None came. The silence remained absolute. He steadied his hand, placed the flint back into the groove, and deepened the mark with a final, forceful gouge. He pulled his hand away. A new, raw line stood out against the dark, damp stone. He looked at the row of tally marks, each one a testament to another day spent in the dark, another day of distance from the home he could no longer see, but refused to forget. The tally marks on the wall blurred into a single jagged streak as Bamsı pulled his gaze toward the high, narrow window. It was a mere slit in the thick stone, yet it held the only truth he had left. He pushed himself upright, his legs shaking from the long disuse. He reached for the ledge, his fingers finding purchase on the cold, damp rock. He hauled his body upward, breath hitching in his chest, with every inch of resistance. He pressed his face against the iron grate, straining to see beyond the shadow of the prison wall. He sought the horizon, imagining the vast, rolling plains he had once traversed with ease. There was only a sliver of sky, but it was blue, a color that felt like a sharp, painful ache, against the gray monotony of his cell. He held his position, balancing on the tips of his toes, refusing to drop back down. This was his tether to the world outside, the only proof that the home he carried in his mind still existed. He watched the light shift, tracking the slow movement of the sun across the unreachable space above, anchored by the simple ironclad loyalty that kept his spirit from dissolving into the dark. Bamsı stayed pressed against the iron grate, his eyes locked on the sliver of sky. The stillness of the prison was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of his own pulse. Then a sharp, frantic sound of beating wings echoed against the stone masonry. He flinched, pulling back from the window. His heart hammering against his ribs in sudden alarm, he waited, muscles coiled, expecting the heavy thud of a guard at the door. No footsteps followed. The sound returned, closer this time, accompanied by the light scrape of claws against the exterior ledge. Bamsı leaned back into the opening, his movements careful and slow. A small bird rested on the iron bars. It tilted its head, its dark bead-like eye fixed directly on his. It opened its beak and released a series of melodic, piercing notes that cut through the oppressive dampness of the cell. The song carried the clarity of the open fields, a vibrant sound that felt entirely foreign to the cold gray stone. Bamsı held his breath, terrified that even a slight movement would shatter the moment. A faint golden shaft of light caught the bird's feathers, and for the first time in years, the crushing weight of the prison walls seemed to recede, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity of spirit. The bird remained still, its tiny claws gripping the rusted iron. Bamsı knew this was not a moment to hesitate. He reached down, his fingers fumbling with the hem of his garment until he found a loose thread. With a sharp, rhythmic tug, he tore a long, narrow strip of fabric away. He dropped to his knees, searching the floor for a sharp-edged pebble. He found one, dark and jagged, and pressed it into the cloth. He began to scratch, his hand moving with frantic, calculated speed. Each mark was a deliberate stroke, a plea for rescue, a testament to his survival. He did not look at the door. He did not look at the shadows. Every ounce of his focus poured into the weave of the material. He finished, his knuckles white, and scrambled back to the window ledge. The bird watched, unblinking. Bamsı looped the fabric around the bird's leg, his movements precise, despite the tremor in his fingers. He knotted the cloth, pulling it tight. The bird shifted, testing the weight, then spread its wings. Bamsı felt the sudden, electric charge of a plan set in motion, a desperate hope taking flight into the air beyond the stone walls. The bird took flight, its wings beating against the stagnant air of the cell. Bamsı watched it clear the ledge, a tiny speck vanishing into the vastness of the sky. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his hands still trembling from the effort. Then the silence broke. A heavy, rhythmic thudding vibrated through the floorboards of the hallway. It was the distinct, metallic strike of iron-shod boots against stone. Bamsı froze. The sound was steady, deliberate, and growing louder with every passing second. He knew the gate. It was the guards' patrol. Panic flared, sharp and cold, but he forced his limbs to move. He kicked a pile of loose dust over the spot where he had knelt, erasing the scuff marks on the floor. He lunged for his corner, pressing his back hard against the rough masonry. He closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow, every nerve ending tuned to the hallway outside. The footsteps stopped. The shadow of a figure stretched across the floor, long and thin, darkening the threshold of his cell. A heavy key rattled against the iron frame of the door, the sound echoing like a death knell in the cramped, airless space. The iron door groaned, the hinges screaming in the stillness as the guard shoved it partially inward. Bamsı did not flinch. He stayed pressed against the wall, his eyes fixed on the narrow sliver of sky visible through the high window. Outside, the bird was already a distant shimmer, gaining altitude and distance with every rhythmic flap of its wings. The guard thrust his head into the space, his gaze sweeping the floor, the corner, and the straw-strewn pallet. Bamsı held his breath, his chest burning. waiting for the inevitable accusation. The guard grunted, a low, guttural sound of suspicion, and stepped fully into the cell. He paced twice, the iron soles of his boots crunching against the grit. He stopped exactly where Bamsı had been kneeling seconds before, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the floor for anything out of place. Bamsı watched the guard's hand tighten on the hilt of his weapon. Every muscle in the room coiled like a spring. The guard lingered, his head tilting toward the window, but the bird was gone, lost in the vast expanse of the horizon. With a dismissive grunt, the guard turned and stomped out, the heavy door slamming shut, with a finality that left the small, dark chamber vibrating in his wake. The lock clicked, a sound that finally signaled the end. Bamsı shoved the door, his shoulder taking the weight of years of confinement. It swung wide, and the light hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled, his eyes stinging as they adjusted to the sudden brilliant glare of the sun. He did not look back. He pushed off the stone threshold, his legs finding strength he had forgotten he possessed. He crossed the prison yard in a blur of movement, leaping over the debris and the uneven ground. The air outside was sharp, tasting of dust and freedom. He reached the perimeter wall and vaulted over, landing hard on the rugged earth beyond. His lungs expanded, pulling in deep drafts of wind that carried the scent of the wild steppes. Every stride was a victory. The terrain was broken and steep, but he navigated it with a frantic, desperate grace. His heart hammered against his ribs, a steady drumbeat of pure, unadulterated release. He was no longer a shadow in a cell. He was movement. He was momentum. He was finally, irrevocably moving toward the horizon, the weight of the stone walls falling away with every mile he put between himself and the dark. The terrain turned hostile, shifting from flat scrubland to jagged, rising rock. Bamsı did not slow. His feet were raw, his breath coming in jagged, rhythmic gasps that burned his throat. Yet he maintained his pace. He navigated the switchbacks of the mountain pass, his hands gripping sharp granite to pull himself upward. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest. But the image of his home served as a singular, burning focus that pushed him past the threshold of pain. A loose stone slipped beneath his weight, sending a spray of gravel into the abyss below. He froze, his fingers digging into the earth until his knuckles turned white. He regained his balance, ignored the tremor in his legs, and climbed until the slope leveled off. He stood at the summit, his chest heaving, and scanned the jagged horizon. There, barely visible through the shimmering heat, the peaks of his homeland rose to meet the sky. He did not blink. He did not hesitate. He adjusted his grip, set his jaw, and began the descent. The distance was immense, but the pull was stronger. He moved with the singular, terrifying speed of a man who had already spent too many years in the dark. The final stretch was a blur of dust and fading light. Bamsı stumbled over the uneven path, his legs heavy, unresponsive wood beneath him. The great gate appeared, a massive structure of iron-bound timber looming against the horizon. He saw the texture of the wood, the deep grooves carved by centuries of wind and weather, and his pace slowed to a ragged walk. He reached out, his trembling fingers brushing the rough surface of the gate. He was so close that he could smell the earth of his home. Then the strength left him entirely. His knees buckled, snapping against the hard-packed dirt with a dull thud. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook and failed. He slumped forward, his forehead pressing hard against the cool, unyielding timber of the gate. The silence of the entrance enveloped him. He did not move. He simply leaned there, his body shuddering with every ragged breath. Tears cut clean channels through the grime on his face, soaking into the dry wood. He had run until there was nothing left to give, and now he was home. The stillness of the gate was a heavy, comforting weight, the final anchor for his long, fractured journey. The wood groaned. From the other side, the heavy iron bolt slid back with a sharp, metallic screech that echoed across the quiet courtyard. Bamsı shifted, his head lifting from the timber as the gate swung inward. The sudden movement threw him off balance, and he fell backward into the dust. Before he could rise, the threshold was swarmed. A blur of movement filled the space. Familiar hands gripped his shoulders, shaking him, confirming he was real. There was no speech, only the sound of ragged, gasping sobs and the thud of bodies colliding in desperate, crushing embraces. They pulled him upright, their fingers digging into his arms, checking for wounds, holding him so tight it stole the air from his lungs. He felt the warmth of their skin, the pressure of their chests against his, the physical reality of home grounding him. Every year of captivity, every night spent in that cold stone room, vanished in the heat of their contact. He wrapped his arms around them, his grip tightening until his own knuckles ached. The world that had been so vast and empty for so long now narrowed down to the circle of their arms. He was no longer a shadow in the dark. He was held. He was found. The intensity of the reunion faded into the steady pulse of the wider encampment. Beyond the gate, the world expanded into the camp of Salur Kazan. Dozens of tents stood tall against the darkening horizon, their silhouettes framed by the vast, starlit sky. A cool breeze rolled across the plains, carrying the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. It caught the heavy fabric of the tent flaps, making them ripple like sails in a calm sea. Everywhere, small campfires sparked into life, casting long, dancing shadows against the earth. The air was thick with the low, rhythmic hum of communal life, the clinking of iron cooking pots, the soft murmur of voices sharing news, and the distant tethering of horses. It was a landscape of order and stability. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, glowing with a steady amber light that cut through the encroaching night. There was no chaos here, only the deliberate, quiet preparation of a home that never truly slept. Every path between the tents was worn smooth, telling a story of constant arrival and departure. The atmosphere breathed with a profound, grounded warmth, a stark contrast to the cold isolation of the road. Here, the night did not threaten. It gathered the people together under a single protective canopy of stars. At the heart of the encampment, Salur Kazan stood before his tent. The fabric had been pulled back, revealing the interior space where a low hearth glowed with steady, controlled heat. He remained motionless, watching the perimeter of the camp. A group of travelers appeared from the edge of the darkness, their movements slow and heavy with the exhaustion of the road. They stopped 20 paces out, their heads bowed, hesitant to cross into the light of the fire. Kazan did not wait for them to speak. He shifted his weight, planted his feet firmly in the packed earth, and extended his arms outward. The gesture was wide, encompassing the space between them and the shelter of his hearth. He took 3 long, deliberate strides forward, his palms open, his expression fixed on the newcomers. He stepped into the shadow line where the firelight met the night, effectively bridging the gap. The travelers looked up, startled by the sudden approach, then lowered their packs as the tension left their shoulders. Kazan stood tall, a solid anchor against the vastness of the plains, his physical presence signaling that the path was clear and the sanctuary was open. He nodded once, a simple, firm movement, and gestured toward the heat of the fire. Kazan turned back to the hearth, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He knelt by the fire and reached into a woven basket, withdrawing a heavy, circular loaf of bread. It was still warm, the crust dusted with flour that caught the firelight. He held the loaf up for a moment, letting the heat radiate against his palms. The travelers stood in a tight semicircle, their eyes fixed on the bread as the scent of baking grain filled the small space. Kazan gripped the loaf with both hands and pulled. The crust gave way with a sharp, dry crack that echoed in the quiet camp. He tore off a large, steaming chunk and pressed it into the calloused hand of the nearest traveler. The man looked at the bread, then at Kazan, and a slow grin broke across his tired face. Kazan tossed his head back and let out a deep, resonant laugh that rolled over the heads of the crowd. He continued to break the loaf, piece by piece, handing portions to every man and woman standing near the fire. As the bread passed from hand to hand, the silence of the night vanished, replaced by the sound of rhythmic chewing and the low, steady murmur of people finally at ease. The act of sharing turned the strangers into a single gathering. Kazan stood and moved toward a rack suspended over the flames. He pulled a heavy blade from his belt and sliced into the roasting meat. The fat dripped onto the glowing embers, sending up a sharp, savory hiss and a cloud of fragrant steam. He skewered the thick portions and passed them to the travelers, who held their wooden bowls out with steady hands. The firelight deepened, casting long, rhythmic shadows against the tent walls. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept across the steps, whipping the flames toward the dry grass of the camp floor. Kazan stepped between the fire and the draft, his body a solid wall, his hand adjusting the position of the wood to keep the blaze contained. The flames settled, licking at the iron rack with renewed intensity. The travelers ate, their focus entirely on the warmth and the food, unaware of the shifting currents outside the circle of light. Kazan remained on his feet, his gaze scanning the perimeter beyond the reach of the fire. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic calm. The meat sizzled, the fire roared, and the space within the camp remained untouched by the vast, dark emptiness of the plains. Every movement he made was measured to keep the hearth burning and the people fed. The laughter faded as the fire dimmed to a rhythmic pulse of orange and gray. One by one, the travelers stretched out on the hard earth, pulling their blankets tight against the cooling air. Within minutes, the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing replaced the chatter. Kazan did not move to join them. He stood at the edge of the circle, his shadow stretching long and thin across the steppe. He reached down and stoked the final embers with a long iron rod, ensuring the light would hold until dawn. A sharp, high-pitched cry pierced the silence from the darkness beyond the camp. Kazan did not flinch. His right hand dropped to the hilt of his sword, his thumb sliding over the leather grip until he felt the cold bite of the steel. He adjusted his stance, planting his heels firmly into the dust. He scanned the horizon, his head turning slowly, eyes tracking the slightest movement in the swaying grass. The travelers shifted in their sleep, unaware of the vast, shifting shadows beyond their circle. Kazan remained a statue of intent, his gaze fixed on the perimeter. He was the barrier between the vulnerability of the sleepers and the vast, hungry emptiness of the night. He exhaled slowly, his chest barely moving, his focus locked on the dark. Kazan remained still, his eyes fixed on the remaining coals. The fire had settled into a dull, pulsing red, casting only a shallow ring of warmth against the encroaching cold. Without a gust of wind to trigger it, the center of the pit began to glow with a sudden, sharp intensity. The dry wood popped, not with the sound of snapping fiber, but with a resonant, metallic ring. A tongue of flame surged upward, bypassing the charcoal and rising in a clean, vertical column. It shifted from the orange of burning timber to a blinding, brilliant gold. Kazan stepped back, his hand pulling away from his sword hilt as the heat changed. It did not sear the skin, but hummed against the air like a vibrating string. The light expanded, pushing the perimeter of the camp further into the night. It caught the dust motes in the air, turning them into swirling specks of gold. The flames reached higher, stretching toward the sky, illuminating the plains with a clarity that defied the hour. The ground beneath the fire began to shimmer, the dirt turning translucent under the intense, impossible luminescence. Kazan watched the blaze, his stance rigid, as the fire transformed the entire clearing into a beacon of unnatural, pulsing light. The golden light stopped its frantic pulsing and settled into a steady, radiant glow that blanketed the steppe. Within the thick, swirling smoke rising from the fire, the air grew heavy and dense. Darker shapes began to detach themselves from the periphery of the light. They did not walk into the camp. They formed out of the very heat waves rising from the ground. A tall, broad-shouldered silhouette solidified near the eastern edge of the fire, its stance wide and immovable. Opposite this, a second figure emerged, head turned toward the dark horizon, hands held, as if gripping invisible iron bars. A third shape took form near the center, chest high and arms braced, radiating a stillness that made the surrounding air ripple. These were not ghosts of smoke, but solid impressions of presence. They stood motionless, casting long, stark shadows that cut across the golden grass. The ground vibrated with a low, rhythmic thrumming that matched a heartbeat. Kazan shifted his weight, his eyes widening as the space between the figures began to shrink. The atmosphere thickened with the pressure of a gathering storm. Every blade of grass in the camp stood rigid. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of a fire that now seemed to hold the weight of entire lifetimes within its golden core. The silhouettes resolved. Boğaç took a step forward, his boot sinking into the soil with the force of a falling stone. Beside him, Bamsı shifted, the tension in his shoulders releasing as he turned to face the center of the camp. Kazan stood firm, his gaze locking onto the others as the space between them vanished. They were no longer separate memories. They were a singular force. The air between them began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the loose stones near the fire pit. It was a physical weight, pressing against the chest of anyone standing near. Boğaç braced his legs, his hands curling as if expecting a challenge, while Bamsı leaned into the light, his posture reflecting a long-held readiness for battle. Kazan stood at the apex, his presence acting as an anchor for the other two. As they aligned, the golden light intensified, bleeding into the very fabric of the earth beneath them. The grass flattened in a perfect circle, pushed outward by the sheer intensity of their combined legends. The wind died completely, leaving a vacuum of sound that amplified the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the three men. They stood in a circle, locked in a silent, powerful communion that made the air itself vibrate with ancient, unyielding strength. The light did not merely shine. It erupted. A pillar of golden luminescence surged from the earth, catching the swirling dust and turning the air into a shimmering, liquid gold. Boğaç, Bamsı, and Kazan stood at the center, their forms rendered into silhouettes of pure, focused intent. The radiance grew so intense that the horizon vanished, consumed by the brilliance. The fire at their feet was no longer a source of heat, but a focal point for this divine manifestation. Every particle of dirt caught in the updraft began to glow, spiraling upward like golden embers rising toward an invisible sky. The ground beneath them cracked, not from destruction, but from the sheer pressure of the energy coalescing within the circle. Boğaç braced his palms against the air. Bamsı stood with his head tilted to catch the light, and Kazan remained motionless, his presence grounding the entire spectacle. The light pulsed in rhythmic waves, matching the thrumming that vibrated through the soil. It was a sight of impossible scale, turning the night into a blinding, eternal noon. The shadows were completely banished, replaced by a clarity that stripped away every uncertainty. They stood as monuments of light, their combined presence pushing the boundaries of the world, creating a spectacle that felt as ancient as the earth itself. The majesty of their assembly held the very wind in suspension. The radiance shifted focus, coalescing into a singular point at the edge of the circle. Dede Korkut stepped forward, his feet finding purchase on the glowing earth. He held his saz, the wood vibrating with a life of its own. He drew a calloused finger across the strings. The first note did not just ring, it pushed. A visible ripple of force traveled through the air, bending the golden light like heat over a summer road. Boğaç leaned into the gust, Bamsı braced his weight against the sudden pressure, and Kazan turned his head, his eyes tracking the sound as it swept across the ground. The melody was low and rhythmic, a steady pulse that echoed the beating of a heart. With every strike of the strings, the earth shifted. The sand beneath them danced in perfect, geometric patterns, responding to the frequency of the music. Dede Korkut played with precision, his hands moving with the certainty of a master. The sound expanded, wrapping around the heroes, weaving through the space between them, until the entire clearing resonated with the tone. It was a bridge of sound, binding the legends to the moment, turning the air into a conduit for ancient memory. The vibration grew deep, rattling the very bones of the earth, yet it remained harmonious, a steady, unyielding song that demanded to be heard. The melody reached a final, soaring note that hung in the air before dissolving into silence. Dede Korkut stood still, the instrument cradled in his hands. He stepped toward Bouncy and extended the saz. The wood was warm, vibrating with the ghost of the song just finished. Bouncy looked at the strings, then at the sage, his paws trembling. As he reached out to take it, the weight of the wood caught him off guard. It was heavier than it looked, anchored by centuries of stories. The moment his fur brushed the frame, a sharp, cold clarity pierced his mind. He did not just hold an object. He held the history of the steppes, the names of the heroes, the sound of the prison walls, and the warmth of the campfires rushed through him. A torrent of memory that forced him to dig his claws into the ground for stability. He gripped the neck of the instrument, his chest heaving as he processed the influx of ancient wisdom. The heroes watched, their faces unreadable, waiting to see if the small creature could anchor such a burden. Bouncy exhaled, his grip tightening. The responsibility was absolute, a heavy, living pulse against his palm, and he refused to let go. The weight of the instrument remained fixed against his frame, yet the initial shock of the memory subsided into a steady, rhythmic thrum. Bouncy shifted his stance, claws finding firm purchase on the ground. He looked up, meeting the gaze of Boğaç first. The warrior shifted his shoulders, offering a brief, sharp tilt of his chin in return. Bouncy moved his focus to Bamsı, whose eyes held the lingering stillness of the prison walls, and finally to Kazan, who stood with the easy posture of a host. There were no words spoken in the clearing. The air between them felt thick, charged with the accumulation of every battle and every meal shared. Bouncy saw the reflection of his own small stature against their towering forms, but the distance between them evaporated. He felt the pulse of the stories matching his own breathing. He inhaled, his chest expanding against the wood of the saz, and then he tilted his head forward. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a nod that carried the gravity of all he had witnessed. The heroes did not move, but the tension in the space shifted, settling into a mutual understanding. Bouncy pulled the book against the instrument, his hold firm and unwavering. The connection was sealed. The golden glow that had saturated the clearing began to thin. It did not vanish all at once, but pulled back from the edges of the trees, leaving the shadows to creep inward. Bouncy watched as the light lost its warmth, turning from a brilliant amber to a pale, dying yellow. Boğaç, Bamsı, and Kazan remained where they stood, but their outlines began to soften, blurring against the darkening background. The sharpness of their presence ebbed away. Dede Korkut looked toward the horizon, his form becoming translucent, his features losing their definition. Bouncy reached out a paw, then stopped, his claws scraping the dry soil. He felt the space between them widening, not through distance, but through the thinning of reality itself. A wave of cool air replaced the heat of the fire. The heroes did not turn away. They stood firm as the world dissolved around them, their expressions fixed in a final, quiet salute. Bouncy pressed the book and the instrument closer to his chest, anchoring the memory as the last of the golden haze drifted into the canopy. The clearing was becoming ordinary again. The vibrant history he had held just moments ago was retreating into the depths of the woods, leaving behind only the soft, cooling scent of damp earth and the encroaching dusk. The ground beneath Bouncy vanished. It did not sink, it simply ceased to exist. A sudden, violent vacuum pulled at his center, dragging him forward into a tunnel of swirling, incoherent light. The colors were no longer warm amber or soft gold. They fractured into jagged streaks of violet, neon blue, and blinding white. Wind roared in his ears, a sound like a rushing waterfall that drowned out his own breath. Bouncy tucked his chin, locking his paws around the book and the instrument. He felt the rapid shift of pressure against his fur, a crushing weight that pushed him from all sides. The world spun at a velocity that defied sight. Every blink revealed a new fragment of the journey, a flash of stone, a flicker of flame, the blur of a mountain range. He was no longer running. He was being propelled by a force that cared nothing for his size. He squeezed his eyes shut as the intensity reached a crescendo. The air grew thin, vibrating against his skin with a hum that rattled his teeth. He felt the momentum peak, a terrifying acceleration that threatened to tear his grip loose, until the roar of the tunnel became a singular, deafening tone. He braced for the impact, his muscles coiled tight, waiting for the end of the fall. The roar vanished. The pressure evaporated in a heartbeat. Bouncy hit the ground with a soft thud, rolling twice before coming to a stop against the base of a familiar oak. He stayed there, limbs splayed, breathing hard. The air here was sharp, damp, and smelled of pine needles and decaying leaves. It was an absolute, suffocating silence. He opened his eyes. Above, the canopy formed a dense ceiling that blocked the sky, filtering the dim light into shades of deep emerald. The chaotic energy of the golden steps and the stone prison was gone. He sat up, his muscles aching from the sudden stop. He looked down at his paws. The leather binding of the book was pressed tight against his chest, its surface cool and solid under his grip. He checked his surroundings, expecting the ripple of air or the echo of a distant voice. But the woods remained motionless. Not a leaf stirred. The contrast hit him with the weight of a physical blow. The world he had just inhabited, with its legends and fire, had left no footprint here. Only the weight of the book against his fur confirmed he had truly been anywhere at all. He took a long, steadying breath, listening to the quiet, and pulled his tail closer to his body. The forest remained locked in its stillness. Bouncy did not move. He leaned his back against the rough bark of the oak, his claws digging shallow furrows into the dirt. The air was cool now, lacking the searing heat of the steppes or the dry dust of the prison. It brushed against his fur with a gentle, damp chill that forced him to shiver. He kept his eyes fixed on the canopy above. The leaves hung motionless, a solid wall of green that refused to tremble. There was no wind, no distant call of a bird, no echo of a saz. He let his grip on the book slacken, just enough to feel the texture of the binding beneath his palm. He watched the shadows shift as the light dimmed, turning the forest floor into a mosaic of gray and charcoal. He was no longer running. He was no longer a witness to wars or a guest in a camp. He was simply present. The transition felt complete, a slow settling of his internal rhythm to match the slow pace of the woods. He drew in a long, slow breath of pine-scented air, held it, and let it out. The silence was no longer a void. It was a sanctuary. The weight of the stories began to shift within him. It was not a heavy burden anymore, but a quiet, rhythmic pulse that mirrored his own heartbeat. The image of Boğaç standing against the solitary mark of Bamsı on his prison wall, and the open tent of Salur Kazan, all these scenes folded into one another. They flowed through his memory, washing away the jagged edges of the journey until only the essence remained. It felt like watching a stirred pond finally return to its natural clarity. Every lesson, every act of loyalty, and every moment of courage settled deep into his chest. There was no more rushing. There was no more searching. The restlessness that had driven him through the woods evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy stillness. He felt the wisdom of the elders anchoring him to the earth. A sense of completeness radiated from his core, smoothing out the tension in his limbs. He allowed the peace to move through his senses, filtering out the remnants of his travel. The chaos of the world outside had been distilled into a singular, tranquil truth. He sat in the center of this newfound quiet, his eyes softening as he embraced the silence, fully present and entirely at rest. The ground beneath him was soft, a thick carpet of living green that yielded to his weight. Bouncy moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. He tested the texture of the moss with a single paw, feeling the damp, cool resilience of the earth. It was the perfect cradle for his exhaustion. He circled once, twice, pressing down the blades of fern and clover until a hollow formed exactly to his shape. He began to pull his limbs inward, drawing his frame into a tight, secure ball. His tail, long and thick, swept around him in a slow arc. It settled over his paws, tucking away the last exposed edge of his body. He let his muscles go entirely loose, surrendering his weight to the ground. The moss pushed back, supporting him, holding him in a grip as gentle as a memory. He felt the dampness of the forest floor seep into his fur, a grounding connection that pulled him closer to the soil. Every breath became shallower, slower, matching the steady rhythm of the woods. He was anchored here, a small, still point in the vastness of the trees. He let his head drop, his chin resting against his own tail, and sank deeper into the soft velvet surface. The long journey was over, and the earth took him in. The air in the whispering woods held the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. Bouncy inhaled deeply, letting the forest atmosphere fill his lungs. Each breath was an anchor, dragging him further away from the wakeful world. His eyelids grew heavy, weighted by the quietude of the surroundings. He did not fight the slide into darkness. Instead, he welcomed it. As his pupils retracted, the world outside faded into a soft, blurred periphery. In the velvet black behind his lids, the memories of the steps in the stone prison did not vanish. They transformed. They became a steady, rhythmic pulse of golden light that resonated within his rib cage. It was a warmth that persisted, even as the evening chill began to touch the forest floor. He felt the ancient wisdom of Dede Korkut as a faint, comforting hum in his blood. The tension in his whiskers vanished. The twitch in his toes stilled. There was no more need to hold the book, no more need to watch the trail. He let his gaze slide shut, completely and finally. The darkness was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of heroes and the certainty of home. He exhaled a long, slow stream of air, and for the first time in his journey, he was truly motionless, cradled by the forest and the stories he kept safe inside. The book remained pressed against his chest, its leather cover warm beneath his paws. A faint, golden pulse emanated from the binding, casting a soft, rhythmic glow onto the surrounding moss. It was a dying ember of light that matched the slowing cadence of his heart. Bouncy did not stir as the forest deepened around him. His breathing was a whisper, a rhythmic rise and fall of fur that barely disturbed the stillness of the night. The stories he carried had found their resting place. They were no longer words or memories, but a steady foundation of quiet strength within him. The golden light from the book flickered, once, twice, and then held a steady, dim radiance that bathed the immediate area in peace. No shadow moved across the clearing. No leaf fell. The woods held their breath in recognition of the traveler who had found his way home. His paws relaxed their grip, yet the book stayed cradled against his body, held by the curve of his posture. The ancient wisdom of the heroes and the vastness of the steppes settled into the silence, becoming part of the earth itself. Everything was still. Everything was finished. The forest stood as a guardian over the sleeper, and the night remained unbroken by any sound, wrapped in the timeless weight of a story finally told.